Hey there, everyone. I'm Senior Airman Angelo Rosario with your look around the Air Force. Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2, has been widely embraced by the Department of Defense as the critical transformation needed at a time in which Russia and China are emerging, in addition to traditional threats. Air Force Chief of Staff General David Goldfein talked about JADC2 during an appearance in Washington, D.C.
I will say that we are having the kinds of discussions on alignment of all the services in our budget submissions and how we talk about the business of joint warfighting in ways that I have not seen in previous years.
General Goldfein noted there are technical advances and cultural shifts that have moved the concept of tightly connected joint warfare forward, not only in the Air Force, but across the entire U.S. military. The U.S. Space Force wants to hire civilians with the expertise, passion, and vision to build the sixth branch of the armed forces as a lean, agile, and focused military service. That's according to General Jay Raymond, Chief of Space Operations and the senior member of the U.S. Space Force. Eligibility for the advertised positions include current or former federal employees in competitive or accepted services and people with specific category qualifications like career transition, military spouses, and veterans. For information about specific Space Force job postings, visit airforce.usajobs.gov. Tyndall Air Force Base is being rebuilt as the installation of the future after being nearly wiped out by Hurricane Michael in 2018. The Air Force sees an opportunity to rebuild to adapt to the 21st century challenges it now faces. Airmen can expect to see major changes to the flight line district to make room for 72 new F-35 Lightning IIs and other potential weapon systems. Tyndall is scheduled to be fully operational by September 2023. And that's your look around the Air Force.
All day, people have thrown out words like historic and first, and I guess those things may be true one day when we look back retrospectively, but right now, we're really truly focused on the future. I'm focused on the future, a future where we build a service that makes the other services look over their shoulder and be a little jealous, a future where we never forget that the weapon system that matters most lives and breathes and is made of flesh and blood, and a future where we never forget that the promise that our service members make to us is a commitment that extends to death, and that this service will work to earn that commitment every single day. I am so privileged and honored to be here and humbled by the fantastic turnout. Thank you so much. I look forward to working with everyone and walking these halls again, which I truly never thought I would say. Thanks so much from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Civilian airmen are essential to carrying out our nation's business and have faithfully served in that role since our inception in 1947. You're critical members of the team and integral to our success. Without you, the mission just doesn't happen.
With a combined force of more than 200,000, Air Force civilians bring stability to the team, as well as leadership, commitment, and excellence. Serving side by side with our uniformed airmen at home or deployed in harm's way, you're part of the fabric that weaves us into the total force we are today. Your contributions are visible wherever the Air Force exists.
Made up of more than 600 occupations, the civilian workforce supports every Air Force endeavor, from nuclear physicists to social workers, from aircraft maintainers to healthcare specialists, from rocket scientists to civil engineers, and the magicians in our depots who keep us in the air. You bring diversity of thought, background, education, and experience. And it's this diversity that gives us the depth and the breadth to take on the many wickedly hard challenges facing our nation. For this, we owe you not only thanks, but the recognition for what you do each and every day.
We're the best Air Force on the planet because of you. And with you, we're only going to get better.
Chief Master Sergeant Arthur Hicks, I didn't know him personally. I was stationed at Vandenberg Air Force Base several years ago. He was a Tuskegee Airman, so it was a unique opportunity for Vandenberg in the local area to have someone that had been a Tuskegee Airman. I actually know Chief just by attending several ALS graduations, and when he unfortunately passed away several years ago, I got to know a lot more about Chief Hicks through his daughter Joyce. And his story is really interesting. Like many Tuskegee Airmen, you know, he had a desire that he wanted to fly airplanes, and he began as an aircraft maintainer. And then after Pearl Harbor, he trained to become a pilot. And during that time, although he I think he was ever deployed to war or ever saw combat, he, in his words, always said he was ready to go. Being an African American in the military, he kind of saw the harsh things of it. So while he was preparing to fight a war abroad, he was fighting one at home. And he shared a lot of the stories and through his daughter Joyce of just simple things that we take for granted, like the social clubs like barbershops, pools, officer clubs. They were all segregated. So while he would train with his unit, when it came time to the end of the day, he was relegated to certain portions of the base. There were things that he could and couldn't do. Chief Hicks wasn't one to just kind of sit back and take things. He fought against racial inequality. He did that throughout his career and outside of his career. He wasn't one to just say, you know, well, this is the way it is. He challenged it, because in his mind, if he was good enough to serve the military, then he should be able to be in the same barbershops and be in the same clubs than than his white counterparts. I get a sense that he felt it was his civic duty, not just as an African American, but just as an American in general, that when there was injustice, that he was going to speak up. And if we didn't have people like Chief Hicks that didn't speak up, we wouldn't be where we're at today. But when we have a month like we do for Black History Month, it's important, I think, that we share these stories. And in terms of how it affected me as a senior enlisted leader, I think what Chief Hicks was the epitome of what we think a chief should be. Chief Hicks and his family had to go through a lot. He had to deal with segregation. You know, I think a lot of times we like to think we've come a long way, and I'd like to think we have, but I also think we have a long way to go.
You know, everybody wants to know what it's like to be in space. What's it like to look down at the Earth, and what does it look like? What does it feel like up there? How does it affect me? It keeps me alive. There is so much stuff flying around the Earth. And you've seen the pictures with what look like 1 million dots of all the satellites that are up there, all of the pieces of debris, and all of it's flying around the Earth at these speeds that are just almost impossible to imagine. The mission that Team Pete is doing in terms of creating this awareness of what's up there and keeping us out of harm's way makes it possible for us to explore space. I studied college up the road, right, at the academy, and I had seen the pictures, and so I understood it, but it takes on a whole new meaning when you do a spacewalk and you see the pits and the holes that have been burrowed into the surface of the station by pieces of debris up there. And so the concept of space debris takes on a whole new meaning, a deeper personal meaning. And all those little specks that you see on pictures of the Earth surrounded by all this junk and all the satellites, you start to realize, hey, I was one of those specks for 200 plus days. The new capabilities that that's going to bring online is just going to help increase the ability for you guys to keep us safe, to watch out for us, to find the things that are a little smaller than what we can track now, and that's going to help us, and it's going to be vital as we go into the future. One of the things, as more countries come together, I think it's an opportunity to cooperate. You know, there is a chance. We've demonstrated that for 2 decades on the space station. An international community can come together and cooperate for the benefit of all. And so there's an opportunity for us to do that together so that we don't create an environment that we can't work in. Everybody, whether you're in a space-related career field or not, needs to realize that you're supporting that larger mission. And we need all of those individual jobs to help support that mission. And you know, it may not seem like you're directly connected, but we all have a role to play. And every one of those roles is critical, and that's why we have to come together as a team to make it work.
Now let's begin to break down the FY21 budget request. Next slide, please. Throughout the rest of the slides, you'll see 3 sets of numbers, with the FY20 President's budget request on the left, the FY20 enacted position in the middle, and the FY21 President's budget request on the right. We did that to provide context, but most of our discussion will focus on the differences between the FY20 enacted and the FY21 request. The stacked columns here show the department-wide breakout in this manner, representing the total force budget request to include active, guard, and reserve. Looking at FY21, when we exclude the $38.2 billion non-blue pass-through, the department's budget request is $169 billion, which is a $900 million increase from the FY20 enacted position, essentially flat. However, it is worth noting that the FY20 enacted position includes $3.5 billion for disaster recovery. The most obvious change in the FY21 request is the breakout of the first separate budget for the newly created U.S. Space Force, shown in the pies on the right. Most of the $15.4 billion request is transferred from previously controlled Air Force appropriations to new Space Force appropriations. Additionally, as part of a department-wide decision to comply with the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2019, $8.9 billion of our base O&M requirements will be funded in the Overseas Contingency Operations account. This is not reflected in the above chart in order to show an apples-to-apples comparison from the FY20 enacted position. Now, before I get into the details of the individual appropriations, let me take a moment to highlight the significance of the first U.S. Space Force budget. Next slide, please. Our potential adversaries are actively devising ways to deny our use of space in a future conflict. And as I said before, winning a future fight will require winning in space. So on December 20th, 2019, we made history as a department, as a military service, and as a nation when the President and Congress established the U.S. Space Force as a co-equal and separate military branch under the Department of the Air Force. By standing up and separately resourcing the Space Force, we're enabling the future, one in which America has a centralized and equal service to recruit, train, and equip experts that can defend our space interests from peer adversaries. We'll continue to work with the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the other services to align and unify DoD space activities into the Space Force, while using existing Air Force infrastructure and support to avoid duplication of effort. In future budgets, space efforts from other military services will consolidate under the Space Force. And we also anticipate the gradual integration of space acquisition authorities and activities, beginning with the transfer of the Space Development Agency in FY22. One of the first requirements is establishing a separate U.S. Space Force budget, which you see on the bottom right of this slide. This FY21 request consists of 4 appropriations, and we anticipate transitioning the military personnel funding in a future budget once we can ensure a seamless transition of pay for our space professionals. As you look at these numbers and the numbers on the subsequent slides, it's important to remember one thing. In the FY20 and previous budgets, all of our space funding was in the Air Force appropriations. However, in order to provide you with an apples-to-apples comparison between FY20 and FY21, we normalized the FY20 columns, moving space program funding out of the U.S. Air Force lines and into the U.S. Space Force lines. With that normalization, you can see that this FY21 Space Force budget request also represents a $900 million increase over FY20, the 4th straight year of growth in overall space funding. And finally, what's not included in this table, although we'll talk about it in the rest of the slides, is the extra support that the Air Force will continue to provide in areas such as base operating support and facility sustainment, something we'll call Blue for Space. Now let's get into the details of each appropriation for our Air Force and Space Force budget requests. Next slide, please. On each of the appropriation slides, you'll see a similar format where we'll include a funding table that shows the overall department budget broken by Air Force and Space Force. And as a reminder that FY20 numbers have been normalized, moving space program funding to the U.S. Space Force budget line to provide that apples-to-apples comparison. You'll also see key budgetary highlights for each branch, with Air Force on the left and Space Force on the right. Our Operations and Maintenance, or O&M appropriation, is our largest account, making up 36% of our FY21 department-wide base budget request. This account finances our day-to-day operations and is critical to our continued efforts to sustain readiness. As you can see, our U.S. Air Force FY21 O&M request increases by $3.2 billion over the FY20 appropriation. This is largely driven by 3 things. First, there's nearly $750 million in growth for civilian pay raises and directed increases in civilian retirement fund contributions. Second, there's $784 million more for the flying hour program to fund 1 million peacetime flying hours needed to train and hone our combat proficiency. And third, there's a $1.7 billion increase to our Weapon System Sustainment, or WSS, portfolio, driven mostly by a difference in the OCO and base accounting between FY20 enacted and the FY21 budget request. In total, this funding keeps us on track to sustain our target readiness gains. Within this appropriation, we also continued to build our digital network, exploring the scalability of the Enterprise IT as a Service efforts that are critical to our Connected Joint Force priority, with the ultimate goal of leveraging industry best practices that will allow our people to focus on warfighting rather than maintaining networks. And we're resourcing our operational JADC2 programs, such as the new Multi-Domain Warfare Officer Schoolhouse and Shadow Operations Center, where we're integrating emerging technologies into live flying operations. We've also prioritized our people with investments across our U.S. Air Force and U.S. Space Force units. For example, we're putting an additional $51 million into our True North initiative, making sure our high-tempo, high-risk men and women have access to the embedded healthcare professionals they need. And we continue to prioritize our youth, MWR, and off-duty education programs. Our U.S. Space Force O&M request includes $2.5 billion for everyday space activities, $1.3 billion of which is for weapon system sustainment. This request also provides the resources for the new U.S. Space Force Headquarters organization and funds about half of the civilian authorizations transferred to the U.S. Space Force in FY21, with the remaining civilians funded within the U.S. Space Force RDT&E appropriation. Finally, as mentioned earlier, the Air Force O&M request includes Blue for Space funds that provide support to the U.S. Space Force. For example, the Air Force O&M request includes Facility Sustainment, Restoration, and Modernization, or FSRM funding, to sustain and modernize our existing facilities across both our Air Force and Space Force bases. We also fund installation support costs, such as utilities and refuse collection, for both services from within the Air Force O&M budget request. In summary, this O&M request enables the department to sustain readiness and care for our people while resourcing the daily operations of both our air and space forces. Next, we'll look at our military personnel appropriation. Next slide, please. In the FY21 budget request, the department's total military end strength continues but slows the growth of the past few years. Our FY21 total force military end strength, which includes both U.S. Air Force and U.S. Space Force, active, Guard, and Reserve, is 512,100 members, an increase of 1,500 over the FY20 programmed end strength. Included in 512,000 end strength figure is 6,434 military authorizations for the U.S. Space Force. Those authorizations, along with the civilian billets that transfer, will bring our U.S. Space Force to a total of about 10,000 personnel in FY21. This budget also includes a 3% military pay raise, a 3.3% increase to basic allowance for housing, and a 2.3% increase to basic allowance for subsistence. The slowing of our overall end strength growth is primarily a reflection of the fact that we were able to repurpose some of the manpower associated with the force structure divestitures I highlighted earlier, reducing the need for total end strength growth in FY21. With the repurposing and modest growth, this budget mitigates shortages in some of our operational squadrons, as well as in our space career fields, most of which are now aligned under the U.S. Space Force. Additionally, this budget addresses the manpower requirements needed to support the bed down of our new F-35s and KC-46s, as well as the acquisition personnel needed to support the maturing B-21 program, and the manning needed to support our developing JADC-2 capabilities. These combined efforts meet our current priority manpower needs while keeping us ahead of the manpower investments required to support the future fight. Next, I'll turn our attention to the department's Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation, or RDT&E budget request. Next slide, please. Our department-wide FY21 RDT&E budget request is $37.3 billion, representing the fifth straight year of significant growth in our RDT&E accounts, and a $2.1 billion increase over FY20. As you can see, the Air Force RDT&E request is $26.9 billion, and the Space Force RDT&E request is $10.3 billion, which is by far the largest share of the overall Space Force FY21 budget. In the Air Force RDT&E request, we're invested heavily to connect the Joint Force with a funding request of $302 million for the Advanced Battle Management System, a more than twofold increase over FY20. This funding will develop the network on multiple fronts through rapid iterations, creating a system of systems as we go, and conducting operational demos every 4 months to rapidly integrate lessons learned. Also in the Air Force request, we continue our recapitalization of 2/3 of the nuclear triad, with $2.8 billion going into the B-21 program and $1.5 billion to further the development of the ground-based strategic deterrent. Additionally, our commitment to next-generation air dominance continues as we capitalize on non-traditional acquisition strategies and resource the most promising technologies needed to close future air superiority gaps. Finally, this request includes $801 million to advance the VC-25B presidential aircraft recapitalization effort, as well as additional funds for testing of the recently named T-7A Red Hawk and funding to continue our prototyping efforts of the hypersonic air-launched rapid response weapon. Turning to the Space Force RDT&E budget, while a portion of this request is classified, the $10.3 billion does include a planned increase for the Next Generation Overhead Persistent Infrared program that I mentioned earlier. This request also includes funds for the Next Generation GPS Operational Control System, a ground component that will allow secure command of both modernized and legacy satellites. As a combined portfolio, the Space Force's RDT&E budget invests to protect and defend our current space assets, to build more resilient and defendable architectures, and to develop offensive capabilities and options to respond if our national security space capabilities are threatened. This total Department of the Air Force RDT&E request continues our commitment to rapidly developing the technologies and capabilities that combatant commanders will require from their future air and space forces. Now let's take a look at the highlights of our procurement appropriations. Next slide, please. The department's combined procurement funding request remains relatively stable again this year with the exception of our munitions account, which we'll discuss in a moment. At the macro level, the Air Force FY21 procurement request totals $22.9 billion and the Space Force procurement request totals $2.4 billion. Within the Air Force procurement budget, this FY21 request includes $5.8 billion to procure 48 F-35As, which is the same number as our FY20 PB request, but less than the FY20 enacted quantity, as we were thankful to receive an additional 14 F-35As from Congress in the FY20 authorization and appropriation bills. This FY20 request also includes $1.4 billion for an additional 12 F-15EXs to replace our aging F-15Cs. Additionally, we continue to recapitalize our tanker fleet with 15 KC-46As and fund the recap of our rotary fleets with $1.2 billion for HH-60Ws and $212 million to start low-rate initial production of the MH-139s. In FY21, we're able to reduce the procurement quantities of some select munitions, like the Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM tail kits, and Small Diameter Bomb, or SDB-1. The significant munition buys that Congress has supported in prior years, along with reduced expenditures of certain munitions, has increased our inventory of several preferred munitions and has us on a path to achieve inventory objective levels in the next few years. At the same time, while we continue a lower level of preferred munitions buys, we begin to shift the development procurement prioritization to munitions that will be demanded in a high-end fight, such as a Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile Extended Range, or JASSM-ER, and Long-Range Anti-Ship Missile, or LRASM. Turning your attention to the Space Force procurement request, we continue to focus on our enhanced GPS-3 constellation, buying 2 satellites this year to continue to increase the accuracy and resilience of GPS for both military and civilian users. We're also funding 3 national security space launches in this budget to assure continued U.S. access to space. Finally, this budget includes $105 million for launch vehicle integration for the 2 final space-based infrared system satellites to maintain our legacy missile warning capability until the next generation OPIR capability is on orbit. Having highlighted the changes in our procurement funding lines, let's take a quick look at our major procurement quantities in the FY21 budget. Next slide, please. On this slide, we show the procurement quantities funded from both base and OCO across FY19, FY20, and FY21. I'll briefly pause here to allow you to review the numbers on this chart. Next slide, please. Similar to military personnel, our military construction budget request supports both the Air Force and the Space Force, even though all of the FY21 funding has been requested in the Air Force military construction appropriation. This is another example of the blue for space support I mentioned earlier. The first thing to point out here is that the total funding from FY20 to FY21 is not an apples-to-apples comparison. As you can see, almost half of the FY20 funding was disaster recovery dollars to rebuild the bases affected by natural disasters, primarily Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida and Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Thanks to tremendous congressional support in FY19 and FY20, we have the funding necessary to fully rebuild those devastated bases, which is why you don't see any FY21 requests from the Air Force for disaster recovery. Excluding the disaster recovery funding in FY20, you can see that our military construction request goes down from FY20 to FY21. Like the select legacy divestitures I mentioned earlier, military construction is another area where we're taking risk in FY21 to accelerate the development of the critical capabilities we know are needed to defeat a peer adversary in the future fight. However, even with reduced overall funding, we prioritize planning and design funding in this FY21 request to ensure that the projects we budget for in FY22 and beyond will be ready to execute. This year's request also prioritizes new mission bed downs, including our F-35 and T-7A simulator projects, and our highest priority improvement projects for existing missions, such as the basic military training dorms at Lackland Air Force Base. Finally, this budget request funds the new mission bed down of the Space Control Facility at Anderson Air Force Base in Guam, as well as the final phase of the Consolidated Space Operations Facility at Schriever Air Force Base, which will house the staffs of the Joint Task Force Space Defense and National Space Defense Center. Most importantly, we remain fully committed to addressing the quality of life concerns for our people and their families, reflected in the FY21 funding to continue the 218 additional positions in our military family housing offices to oversee the execution of our privatized housing contracts across all of our bases. That was the final base budget account. So let's take a look at the OCO slides. Next slide, please. Similar to our FY20 President's budget request, this year's budget includes 3 categories of OCO funding: direct war costs, enduring OCO requirements, and OCO for base. The first traditional OCO category is OCO for direct war costs, which includes combat or direct combat support costs that will continue once combat, or will not continue once combat operations end. The second category is OCO for enduring requirements, which includes requirements previously funded in OCO for in-theater and in-CONUS activities that will likely continue even after combat operations cease. This year, our Air Force budget in these 2 categories funds counterterrorism operations, builds our deterrence infrastructure in Europe, replenishes munitions that have been used during operations, and buys H-860Ws to replace 3 combat rescue helicopters that we lost in combat. You'll also note a small amount of Space Force OCO requirements, specifically $77 million for counter space operations, satellite communications in support of our overseas efforts, and the sustainment of our space-based infrared system. Finally, this budget includes $8.9 billion in the Air Force's OCO for base category, which funds traditional base budget requirements, specifically weapon system sustainment. Now, to be transparent, we also included this $8.9 billion in the previous O&M slide to enable us to show you an apples-to-apples comparison between FY20 and FY21. But the funding for this requirement will be requested in the OCO portion of our budget. Let me close with a few final thoughts. Next slide, please. As the National Defense Strategy warns, without a clear commitment to modernizing our military, we will rapidly lose our military advantage and be left with a force that relies on legacy capabilities that are irrelevant against the future threat. This FY21 budget builds toward the future air and space forces that combatant commanders will need to win against any adversary across all domains. Our request was driven by an imperative to invest not just in quantity, not just in near-term capacity, but also in quality to develop the integrated joint force capabilities that tip the balance of future power decidedly in the United States' favor. To that end, we made tough choices, taking calculated near-term capacity and infrastructure risks to advance the survivable and effective capabilities of the future. And we've built the first ever budget request for the United States Space Force, a critical step on the path to space superiority. As we look to the future, we'll continue to make difficult trades to avoid unacceptable capability gaps in the out years while preserving the readiness gains we've worked hard to achieve. But we cannot do this alone. We ask Congress and our stakeholders to embrace these tough choices now, to partner with us in achieving irreversible implementation of the National Defense Strategy to help us become the air and space forces that our nation needs. Thank you very much. I welcome your questions.
The Air Force is full of opportunities, new experiences, chances to travel, and most prominently, a plethora of different careers to choose from. Amidst this vast array of choices remains a job that many airmen don't even know is a possibility, a career that is quite literally out of this world. Many children dream of being something exciting when they grow up: firemen, scientists, fighter pilots. But as they get older, these ambitions often fade or seem increasingly unattainable. Some people continue to foster these aspirations, however, and eventually prove that with hard work and perseverance, even your most impractical daydream can be realized.
You know, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a lot of things. I wanted to be a race car driver, a rock star, an astronaut. I got a chance to see the space shuttle transit across the country through a chain link fence at the end of a telephoto lens that my dad had set up for me because he knew I was excited about it. And it's something that I'll always remember and was really motivational for me. When I was in high school, I thought about it some more and decided I wanted to be an engineer. When I finished my high school education, the Air Force at the time needed physicists. They offered me a scholarship for ROTC to go and get that degree. While I was an ROTC student, we used to have AFSCs, Air Force Specialty Code, and astronaut was one of the choices. And so as an ROTC student, I put that down on my dream sheet, and then they sent me my dream sheet back and said, hey, you're not qualified to fill out that you want to be an astronaut just yet. You need to check a few more boxes before you can have that opportunity. When the time came for me to come into the Air Force, they actually sent me to a mechanical engineering position at a research laboratory. So I worked at Eglin Air Force Base and took the opportunity from there to apply to test pilot school. In my class, I think a majority of people applied to be astronauts. 4 of us ended up being interviewed by NASA, and 2 of us ended up being selected.
I remember my parents bringing up when I was a kid, invited me in to watch the moon landing. I was 5 at the time, to watch the first one on a black and white TV.
Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
That's kind of what spurred my interest about NASA and space, and if I was really lucky to get the chance to do that. It was a far-off dream to become an astronaut, something that I really was thinking about if I was lucky enough to have the opportunity, but I really wanted to be a fighter pilot. I went to pilot training and then flew F-4s. I was an instructor pilot in the Air Force, flying T-38s. I went to Eglin Air Force Base and flew the F-15C. From there, I'd applied to test pilot school, and then after that, I applied to NASA to become an astronaut. I flew on STS-126 and then STS-133. Hopefully, if I'm lucky, I'll get a chance to fly again on an upcoming commercial crew flight, which is a replacement for the space shuttle.
Since the end of the shuttle program in 2011, the United States has depended on Russia to launch our astronauts into space. The Commercial Crew Program was created by NASA to have American commercial organizations design and build spacecraft that will ferry astronauts and equipment to and from the International Space Station, eliminating dependency on Russian space launches.
This whole program is about innovation. We are doing everything different. We're doing everything new in a lot of ways. These are commercial providers. They are building these rockets. We're sharing the responsibility. We're sharing the accountability with them. In the past, NASA has always bought the rocket and then we own it and we go and use it. So the difference here is that we are just buying a space transportation service. We're not buying the rocket.
Boeing and SpaceX are going to be building our next rocket ships, and we'll be riding on them as NASA astronauts. My responsibility right now is to work with both of those companies to ensure we get a spaceship that we can operate back and forth to the International Space Station safely and as quickly as possible.
The intent is for both those companies to go out and use their vehicle, not just for NASA. Now they've got a certified vehicle that can get people into space, not just for what the government wants to do, but for other entities, whether it's universities, schools, laboratories. It'll change the way we do things in space.
While military experience is not required to become an astronaut, many have or are serving. And when it comes down to weighing risks, working as a team, and dealing with deployments, being an astronaut isn't all that different from being an active duty military member.
I think I was really excited about being an astronaut because of the idea, but then when I came for my interview, I realized that what I was doing as a flight test engineer was very similar to what was happening here in Houston. So making sure things were happening on schedule, making sure it was ready when the air crew, the astronauts came out to actually fly it, that's what folks were doing. So that career mapped really well to what my job was inside of the Air Force.
I've got a lot of engineering background, I've got a lot of education, and it's still amazing to me that airplanes fly. Very heavy, big machines, and then you put that to space, that we can make a spaceship go up, and in 8.5 minutes you get from the ground into orbit, and you're moving 17,500 miles per hour around the planet, and you're seeing 16 sunrises and sunsets every day.
Houston, this is Snoopy.
It's a surreal moment when you're sitting on orbit and you're hearing the voices in the background, you're hearing the radios going, you hear your crewmates that are working together.
Snoop, Houston, we copy.
And to me, that's the coolest part of space, is you realize it was a huge team, not just you individually, that got you to space. And the Air Force is just like that. It's a huge team that gives us capability, whether it's in space, in the air, all those things. It takes everybody to make the unit a success. And to me, it's that innovation of the Air Force, that excitement to change and keep doing things different, that really makes a big difference in the world.
As a high school student, I watched the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster when that happened years and years ago. And depending on your personality, that can kind of go one of two ways. You can think about it as, hey, that was really dangerous, and I don't necessarily want to be a part of that. For me, it was a motivation that, hey, those astronauts were trying to do something really important, and it was really hard, and we ended up losing them in that process. Now, those astronauts would probably be the first people lining up to tell me that somebody should continue doing what they were doing because they believed that that mission was that important. All of us who've joined the military have a little bit of that risk that's out there, right? So you don't join the military with the expectation that there isn't risk. You've just balanced that that risk is important enough that you're going to go off and execute the mission that's in front of you.
I think the training that I received in the Air Force prepared me greatly to be an astronaut. It's not just the flying experience, it's just the whole military atmosphere. We have people from all the different branches of service, and it's really that mindset that you get in the military about how things get done, because just like flying an airplane, that was my experience in the Air Force. Whatever airplane you're flying at the time, you got to know all the different switches and things. Flying in space is no different. Ultimately, as an astronaut, you're an operator, whether you're operating your spacesuit, you're operating the spaceship, and just about every training course that you have in the military has some applicability to the training to get into space. My wife was a pilot in the military, so she knew how things worked in the military, and even now I still fly airplanes here at NASA, and it's the same thing. I can't just make up a lot of stories because she knows what's right and what's wrong, in the story that I tell.
My wife is also an astronaut, so she knows what my job entails, and she knows the risks that are out there. And so when I'm maybe complaining or challenged on any given day, she recognizes the challenge that I'm going through like most other people would not be able to. Now, at the same time, when you watch your spouse launch into space, which I've done once and she's done twice, it's really, really difficult. You may actually prefer to be at the controls of the spaceship yourself.
Throughout history, explorers like Leif Erikson and Marco Polo have traversed the planet, looking for different ways of life and scrutinizing the mysteries of existence. Although there's not much left to find on the surface, exploration continues well beyond our atmosphere. For those willing to put in the time and effort, opportunities exist for many young Americans to actually become interstellar explorers. And who knows, maybe one day we'll all be able to go into space.
So I'm often asked, what should I do to become an astronaut? And one of the things that I say is really not taking away opportunities and finding something that you really enjoy.
To me, the biggest thing you got to have is passion. So find some passion, whatever that passion is, whether it's space, it could be being a doctor, it could be a teacher, it could be, there's multiple jobs out there.
Finding something that's exciting to you and then doing it well is the path to become an astronaut.
There are a lot of different flavors of astronauts out there. There's veterinarians, there's doctors,
professors, engineers,
scientists, we have pilots, we have school teachers, we have a wide range of people who've become astronauts. And so I wouldn't say what you need to do is to go be an engineer and go to Air Force Test Pilot School and then get selected to be an astronaut just like I did. Do something that you really enjoy and do it well, and I think the opportunities are still out there to be an astronaut for a wide range of careers.
The world is changing. I remember when I grew up in the age when if I asked a person what a computer was good for, they'd say not a whole lot. And now most people are carrying computers in their pockets. And if you ask people at the beginning of 401 what's aviation good for, they probably would have said not a whole lot. But now you look at all of the things that aviation touches, and that's the way space travel is going to change as well. A lot of people, if you ask them what do we use space for, most of the time they say, I don't know, not a lot. But if you really look at it, there's all kinds of things that space is doing now, and there's even a whole bunch more things that are waiting to come. And the intent of this commercial crew program is to get space vehicles out there. There's no doubt in my mind we're going to have colonies on the moon, on Mars, and in different locations. It's just the question is when.
We're trying to not only get a ride for our astronauts to go to the space station, but we're also trying to enable the commercial space companies to have this capability for other customers. Great nations explore. You know, we don't want to turn in on ourselves. We've had that exploration spirit from the very beginning, from the people that came to this country, to the people that moved across this country, to the people that explore deep into the ocean. We're going to continue to explore out in space.
We call them the backbone for a reason, right? They're the ones making it happen every day. But I think it takes a special person to actually understand and how they have their own life situations kind of planned and balanced enough that they can, you know, provide the right guidance to someone else.
Yeah, so speaking of guidance, what guidance would you give to, you know, the young up-and-coming NCOs who aspire to be mentors? What advice would you give them for?
I'll tell you, something that I push on a daily basis is, man, stick true to who you are. You know, one of the things that I think has made me have these opportunities is that I never forgot where I came from. You know, we live on this golden rule of your word is everything, but you have to stick to it. It's easy to maneuver away from that because, you know, there's a lot of self in what we do. We want to make sure that we're positioning ourselves for the right jobs and the right opportunities, but you gotta know your own. You know, you gotta be attached to your vulnerabilities. You gotta know yourself, and I think in knowing you, you'll have a better opportunity to explore, and you'll see that in others.
I want to describe for you my first experience in combat. So there we were, full package going across day one of Desert Storm. And you know, you're always sort of wondering, how am I going to react to the enemy? Is my training going to come through for me? And then we hear on the radio, splash, MiG-29. Because I was far enough forward in the formation, I see an aircraft hit the ground and explode. And And I remember that moment in my cockpit like it was yesterday, because all of a sudden I realized none of this was new. I actually had been in this environment before, this exact environment before. I'd seen these formations. I'd heard these radio calls, the radar warning receiver screaming at me. I'd heard that before. I'd seen Smoky Sam simulators. I'd seen AAA simulators. I'd heard all the radio calls before, and I realized I was in an environment that was actually not. I'd done all of this before at Red Flag. And what that experience taught me and continues to teach us is the importance of confidence under fire. And I would offer to us as leaders, and that's to ensure that every airman that we send into harm's way is properly organized, trained, equipped, and well led, so they can go forward and do the nation's business. That's sacred duty for us. That one, as servant leaders, we got to get right.
We're looking at the C2 structure that allows us to execute global campaign plans. And the example I use to get us to think about what this means, right? Let's think about a single trajectory of a missile launched from North Korea. So we get an IR infrared plume, we have an event, right? We get a sense of it, right? We don't know exactly what it is yet, we just know we have an event. On that moment, when we have an event, who's the supported commander? It would be USFK, US Forces Korea, and Indo-PACOM. And so now it starts heading up, and we still don't know what it is. We know it's a launch of some kind, and it started heading up, it's headed towards space, and we're not sure whether it's an actually anti-satellite missile and whether we have to take action. At that point, who is the supported commander when it's going straight up? It's the STRATCOM commander, soon to be now the U.S. Space Command commander. But now we're continuing to characterize it, and it tips over and it starts heading towards one of our allies or partners. Who's the supported commander? It goes back to Indo-PACOM. And then it overflies, then it starts heading towards the west coast of the United States. Who's the supported commander? It just became NORTHCOM NORAD. So in the trajectory of a single missile flight, we have changed supported and supporting relationships while the missile's in flight. Our C2 has to be agile enough for that. And so we're thinking about global campaign plans and global fires to make sure that we're ready for that global kind of a fight.